Thanks everybody for coming and welcome to this session on building data-driven collection and list apps using XAML. My name is Lawrence Moroney. I'm a senior program manager at Microsoft. I've been working with XAML, particularly in Silverlight, since it was knee-high to a grasshopper. I wrote one of the first books on WPF, and I worked with Silverlight since it was called WPFE. Anybody remember WPFE? Yeah, with the quotes. You got to don't forget the quotes. You got to put the quotes around it. And so working through with Silverlight, and now working on Windows 8, and I've been working on the XAML team for Windows 8 for a little while. My responsibilities have been in building some of the apps that you may have seen on your brand new slates. Has everybody got a slate? You all like them? Cool, cool. Has anybody played chess yet? Cool. Well, that's my baby. So I built that chess game back at the beginning of July. Does anybody like the chess game? I can't repeat that for the video, sorry. I'll paraphrase, except for it kicked his bottom. No. So I'm going to be referring to the chess app a few times during the talk as we're talking about data, and just really want to look at just a whistle-stop tour of some of the features of building data-driven apps, be they collection apps, be they list apps, or be they even like a casual game like chess. So one of the core design tenets of Windows 8 has been great apps are connected and alive with content and activity. Now, there's four really powerful words in this sentence. The first one is great. Okay? If you want your app to be great, let it be connected, let it be alive, and let it have content and activity. Actually, there's 5 words, right? Another great app is one that is connected. It's not much use having a stock ticker app if it doesn't have live stock ticker updates, right? And when you are connecting to the internet, when you're connecting to a data service, you want that to be as easy as possible, and you want the plumbing basically to get out of your way to allow you to build the best possible connected app. One of the design concepts of Windows 8 was that your apps are alive. Alive meaning things such as the live tiles on the desktop are able to update, dynamically. You've seen the stock ticker or the weather app, how they update automatically. And, they have content and activity. So, where's that content going to come from? What kind of activity are you going to have in your application? And what we've been working hard to do is to provide the tools and provide the frameworks that will allow you to build these great apps and make sure that they can be connected, alive, and make sure that you can get your content into these apps as easy as possible and have great activity in the apps, things just such as the Windows personality. Has anybody done any programming yet, by the way, on their slates? Just out of interest, anybody built any apps? Wow, quite a few. Cool. So you may have noticed things such as the grid view in Windows, that when you add items to the grid view, the way they appear, they kind of slide in and nudge over to the left a little bit. And that type of activity, that kind of liveliness in your application is something that comes along, effectively for free when you're using the controls. For the sake of the folks watching the video, or for some of you folks who may have gone to these sessions earlier on, some of the related sessions that I'd strongly recommend you take a look at to complement this one are Joe Stegman did a great one on Metro-style apps in XAML. What do you need to know? What's new? What's different? What do you need to know to be able to be an effective XAML developer? If you've built XAML using WPF, if you've built XAML using Silverlight or Windows Phone or any of those things, some of the great things you need to know to be able to build Metro-style apps. If you've seen it already, if you're live here at the conference, that's great. If you're watching the video, I recommend you go and take a look at that one. Ditto with making great touch apps using XAML. A joke that we had going around the campus was that, as we were building out the XAML stuff for Metro-style apps, we should, maybe give it a name like the WPF, the Windows Presentation Foundation, and I recommend we call it the Windows Touch Foundation. But then when we realized what the acronym for that was, maybe it's better not to. So, and then the final one, and the one that very, very strongly complements this talk, is building polished collection and list apps using XAML. You see, my talk is building data-driven collection and list apps. So I'm going to be talking about some of the plumbing of getting data off the web, building your UI in XAML, and making these two meet so that you can have your connection. And Hamid in that session, he's going into a lot more depth on the controls themselves, and how you can build polished stuff, how you can really make your collection shine. So the agenda, what we're going to be looking at today, first of all, is I really want to focus on what's new and what's different for XAML developers in Windows 8. There's not a whole lot different, which is good. So if you've got your XAML skills already, I mean, they will transfer over right away. Like some of the folks that I asked earlier on who have built XAML applications, let me hear you a yay if you agree. Was it easy for you if you've got existing XAML skills? Yeah, a few yays. So, there's really not a whole lot new there. Some of the things that are new, and I find particularly exciting, particularly the asynchronous patterns, but the actual overall design pattern for building things changes a little bit when you're using a tablet as opposed to using like the PC, be it a beige box under your desk or be it a modern high-powered laptop like this one. And to just start thinking a little bit differently about how you architect your apps and design them for the end users who are walking around with this thin device that's connected via the AT&T plan that you've gotten or whatever other plan they're going to be using or Wi-Fi or stuff like that. To start thinking a little bit about how you architect your apps, with those end users in mind and just how they may be consuming your data a little bit differently and how they may be using their device a little bit differently. As I mentioned earlier on, if you were to ask me my one favorite new thing in C# or VB development for Windows 8, it's the new asynchronous patterns. Has anybody tried them yet? The async keyword and the await and stuff like that. Okay, I see one hand. Cool. To start thinking in terms of local data as well as connected data, in the past, I used to build lots of, how many of you, I'm sure you're the same as me, 5-6 years ago, you probably built applications in .NET, or 10 years ago, you built applications in VB with an Access database and the JET engine connecting the two of them. That's very, very effective stuff, but that's the stuff of the past, and we start going towards slates to start thinking about how we use local data in them. How are you going to format your data for Windows 8 controls? Now, you may be familiar with you're going to connect to a service to get data. The data is retrieved as XML or JSON or something like that. In the case of XML, you then create an IEnumerable of a particular class. You use link to be able to do that. You bind your list control or your grid control or something like that to it. And off you go. Now, generally, that's 99% of the time that's true when doing it for Windows 8. There's one exception, and that is if you're using the grid view, you've probably seen or heard of something that's called semantic zoom. So, for example, if I built a grid view containing a list of people's names, like a contact book, I can then semantic zoom out of that and see like A, B, C, D, E, and then touch on E to go in to see the people's names that begin with E. How do you format your data for that to work? That's the one exception that I see in Windows 8. That's the one thing that's different, is that you can't just pass an IEnumerable off to the grid view and expect the grid view to do that automatically. You've got to attribute it. For example, if it's an alphabetized list like that, you've got to attribute it in a particular way that the grid view can pick it up. Or if you were doing something else, like, I don't know, grades or colors or something along those lines, because the grid view itself doesn't know how you are going to be classifying the data. That's something that you need to specify. Hamid's talk that I spoke about earlier on, he's going into that in a lot of detail. I'll be showing it a little bit in this talk. But other than that one exception, pretty much everything, if you're an existing XAML developer that you know already, is going to work as you go over to Windows 8. What we'll be leaving today with an example of connecting to the web, getting data from the web, binding it into a UI. I'm going to go step by step through building a simple application, which I call a related image browser. And the related image browser is kind of fun that you can do things like, anybody remember the old game, it was the Kevin Bacon game, where like anybody in the world could be seen 7 degrees of separation from Kevin Bacon. I found now the more modern, updated version of that one, particularly with how images are stored on the web and how images, by search engines such as Bing, they're related to each other. I found that just about everybody in the world has some degree of separation from Justin Bieber. And I'll show that in a moment and see that, when I was testing through this application, I found I'm personally 2 degrees of separation from Justin Bieber. And when I have a teenage daughter, and when I told her, hey, look, I've got 2 degrees of separation from Justin Bieber, according to Bing, she went, what's the degree of separation? So, never mind. So I'm going to show that application and show building that and how to build that and how to do the data binding to the images and all that good stuff. So actually, I'll show that right now. So I'm just going to get it started, and then I'll switch over. Laptop. Okay, you can see it all right. So this is an example of, this is an application that I've built. I'm going to show the XAML one, and I'll show the code behind this one in a moment. But here's an example of like, I have this related image search engine. I've defaulted it to say, hey, search for images based on Seattle. And what it's going to do is it's going to go out to Bing. It's going to do a search for the word Seattle. It's going to return the images that match the word Seattle. And it's going to show them in the list view on the left-hand side of the screen here. And then when I select something in this one, what it's going to do is it's going to take the text of that, like in this case, CCA forum meeting at Seattle. It's going to pass that up to Bing. It's going to get the data back from Bing. And it's going to bind that to this grid view over on the right. And it's one of these scrollable grid views. I don't have a touchscreen monitor on this laptop, but if I had a touchscreen monitor, I'll be able to pan left and right the same way as I've been able to, as you can do with your brand spanking new devices. And then when I select one of the images over here on the grid view, it's going to do the search up to Bing and then go back and bind them down to the list view on the left. And I can keep clicking around like this. And I usually end up looking at pictures of cars or something like that. And to talk about the degrees of separation game, so for example, if I do a search for myself here, I can find a number of things, covers of some of the books that I've written. And this was me back when I used to play football. I tried out for the New England Patriots, but I didn't really get on with Tom Brady. So, and I can scroll and I can look at some of the images here. So if I select this one, and, like for example, if I take a look at this image here, it's a pretty blurry image, but I was one of the writers of a TV show that's still being filmed. And this is a blurry picture of us in the writer's room as we're actually writing it. If I select that one and go back up to Bing, who do I end up with? Justin Bieber, okay? So that's my 2 degrees separation of him. And oh, by the way, if you haven't seen this one already, this was back when my hair was a bit longer than it is today. So. And so I thought I was so proud of myself being only 2 degrees of separation from Justin, but then I typed in, anybody heard of this guy, Scott Guthrie? No, nobody's heard of him. Well, Scott Guthrie's he's another software developer in Microsoft, and when I go in here and I select this image of Scott Guthrie, I'm dead jealous that he's only 1 degree of separation from him. So it's like, I guess Scott's slightly more important than I am, at least in Justin's world. So, this is the example of the application. We're going to see how to build this using some of the, the asynchronous web calls that are available within Silverlight. Some of the controls, sorry, did I say Silverlight? In Windows 8, some of the controls that are available now to Windows 8 developers, like the list view and the grid view that you're seeing here. And just like, it's about 20 lines of code to be able to build this. If you want to build this thing yourself and you don't see everything that's in the presentation, we actually have a hands-on lab. So if you go to the hands-on lab area, which is in the Expo Center, one of the hands-on labs is actually building this application. Alrighty, so let me switch back here. Okay, where did I put my clicker? So when it comes to building an application like this one, I like to break it down really into 3 different tasks. The first task is, what do you do to get your data? How do you acquire your data? What do you need to be aware of as a new, brand spanking new Windows 8 developer, like what's new and what's different in acquiring data? Then the next thing is like, once you've got your data, what do you do with it? How do you shape it so that the UI can manage it? And then the third part of it is that now you've presented it in your UI, you do your binding, how do you interact with your data? So the first of these 3 pillars I just want to talk about, and some of the new and different things in actually acquiring data. Now, I recommend the design pattern to be, if you want to do relational database access, put a service tier in front of it. I really think it's, particularly in the case of if you have a lightweight device like a tablet, relational database access directly from the tablet up to a SQL Server database or to a MySQL database or something like that, I generally consider to be pretty bad practice. I always much prefer to put a service tier in front of it. That way the service tier can be used and consumed by different clients. You can expose your data in different ways, as well as you can take advantage of the things in the database engine like connection pooling and all that kind of stuff. And I'm not just saying this because like the ADO.NET stuff isn't yet available to Windows 8 developers. I just think it's the best practice to do this to begin with anyway. So think about if you're trying to expose your database, if you're trying to expose SQL Server or MySQL stuff or any of that kind of thing, put a service tier in front of it. And like an XML over HTTP or a JSON over HTTP or something like that service tier or a web service or whatever, and access your data that way. Secondly, when it comes to local app storage, A lot of the time, if you're thinking about putting like I said in the past, you have like a jet engine to connect to an Access database. If you want to start using something like ADO.NET to connect to a local, SQL Server DB, I usually consider that a 20-pound hammer for a 1-pound nail. It's not really the most effective solution in most cases. Now, when it comes to Windows 8 apps, that's not an option to you right now. And so I would think in terms of using local file storage, but not using local database storage. So to go back to the chess game that I spoke about earlier, a chess game tends to be a very long-running transaction. It's not like Angry Birds, where you can shoot a few birds at a few pigs and, have your needs satisfied within a couple of minutes. A chess game, when it doesn't kick your butt like it does for the gentleman in the first row, is generally something that can last like maybe an hour or 2 hours, or it's a long-running game. Now, if you sit down and you pull out your new tablet and you start to play chess against the computer, and after 5 minutes you've done 10 moves and the computer's done 10 moves, and you want to go on to something else, what Windows 8 does once you've moved on to something else, and what the user expects, is that when they switch to another application, if they at some point the next day switch back to chess, they're able to go back to the state that they were in to begin with. They're not thinking in terms of, and our user research has shown, they're not thinking in terms of, okay, I don't want to play chess anymore, I'm going to do email now, I got to save my chess game, I got to press X on the top right-hand corner of the window, I got to say, yes, I'm sure I want to exit chess and do something else now and do all those steps. They're used to, like on an iPad, pressing the home screen and tapping on the home button and tapping on a different icon to get to their email. On a phone, to be able to touch like the Windows button or the home button or something like that and move to something else. And the operating system to handle all that for them. So the chess game in Windows, it works exactly like that, and it's using local app storage. So as soon as, like, if you swipe in from the left to start another application, or you press the Windows button to get the desktop back, the operating system starts to, it sticks the chess game into the background. After about 15 seconds of inactivity, it begins to suspend the game, and then once it's suspended the game, it boots it out of memory. And then what do you do in that case? .NET is providing you events that get called, that you can respond to those events, and that's a great time to start using local app storage. In the case of the chess game, all I've done, instead of using a relational database, is, the board has, like, it's 128 bytes of data. There's so that's the current position of the board. Who's going to move now? Is it black or is it white? How many time has elapsed on black and white? Are you currently in check, or is somebody currently in check? Whose move is next? That type of thing. And I just serialize all that out as binary data. It's like less than a kilobyte of data. It's very, very easy to do in C# or VB. And then when, in retrospect, then, like when the user then reactivates the game, .NET sends in an event, it captures that event, and it does exactly the opposite. It deserializes the data back in. No database necessary. So the local app storage and being able to use local app storage to save stuff out like that in the case of something like a chess game is very, very powerful, and the amount of data is very, very little. In addition to that, your apps within Windows 8 can access the local file system. So as you'll see, I'll use chess again as an example. We put a little export button on the app bar, so you can flick up the app bar, you can press the export button, and it does the same thing, but instead of saving it in the app's local storage, it allows you to save off that file anywhere, so you could then maybe take that to a different computer and play it on there. So these are some of the things that you've got to think about in acquiring data. So if you're pulling data from the cloud, I would say rule number one is, put a service tier in front of your data. Access that service tier, and there's lots of benefits from that. Rule number two, for local app storage, just think about serializing and deserializing data. It's very, very simple to do. Okay, so again, thinking about acquiring data from the web, the things that I recommend, using XML over HTTP is my personal favorite. It's very simple, it's very straightforward, it's almost impossible to get wrong. JSON over HTTP is also a good example. ASMX web services, we all remember them, right? And so with Visual Studio Express, you can create a proxy client to an ASMX web service. You talk to your proxy client. Everything else works magically. Sockets. You saw yesterday when Scott did his demo, he was using HTML5 WebSockets to build a little chat thing for the people playing the game, the Tanker. Was it called Tanker? That game. If you want to have data which is generally pushed asynchronously or serialized data like stock quotes or chat or something like that, sockets is a great way to get data, and you can use sockets in your Windows 8 application, be it C# or VB or whatever language you're using to build against your XAML. And then, of course, OData. We're all familiar with OData, and OData is, to me, I see it as it's like ASMX Web Services' big brother, or little brother because it's younger. Okay, so my personal favorite thing, as I've mentioned from the beginning, is I think my favorite thing in Windows 8 and Windows 8 development is asynchronous retrieval of web data using the new await patterns. I don't know about you guys, but for years and years and years, when working in various different companies and various different industries, the principle and the difficulties of await or of getting data asynchronously has always been a real pain in the butt. So there's so many different ways that it could be done. There's so much coding that somebody would have to do to be able to get data asynchronously. And the best way that I have seen to be able to do it prior to this, and one of the things I love about .NET was the fact that if you wanted to do an asynchronous call to something, typically you would create a proxy class. The proxy class had an async call function. You would call that function. You would set up an event handler that would be called when the function returned, and then you would put your code to manage what you want to do with the data into that event handler. So it might be something like I would create a web client class, I would call a service to get XML, and then I would specify when that's finished, call function foo, and then the .NET framework would magically call function foo when the transaction had finished. And that was simple, and it's taken me 10 sentences to describe it, right? If you've programmed, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't programmed, if you're standing in front of like a CFO or something and saying, here's how we're going to do our asynchronous calling of data, they've probably fallen asleep by this point. And that was the simplest way to do it prior to the new await pattern. If you haven't seen it, I'm going to show some code for it in a moment. And the other really nice thing about it, and one of the banes of my life when I was building Silverlight applications, was it blocking the UI thread when you're doing these things, and you got to write that kind of gobbledygook dispatcher.begin invoke, open bracket, close bracket, implies do something. To me, this looks like Objective-C code, and that's not necessarily a good thing. And so you don't require any of that. So as you start doing your asynchronous calls, and I'll show how to do it with the Bing data in a moment, you're not blocking a UI thread. So let's take a look at that. I will switch over to my laptop. So the application that we saw a moment ago, let me see. Okay, can you guys read the code okay? Is it big enough, folks at the back? I see nodding heads. Okay, good. It's always a pain when you can't read the code if you're sitting in the back. So what I mentioned beforehand in the past, if you had a service, you'd have to use Visual Studio to create a proxy class to that service. That proxy class would usually have an async call and an async callback function for whatever your method is. If you were lucky enough that this service that you were building supported generating a proxy class by publishing a WSDL, that wasn't always the case. So here's an example of where I'm using the new functionality, the new await async functionality. So first of all, when I first load my application, I'm calling this thing called fetch Bing pics. I'm just passing it Seattle, and I'm passing it a reference to my list view object. Now, if you look carefully at fetch Bing pics, it's not just a public void, it's a public async void. So I have to attribute my function as an async function in this case to be able to use the await keyword. And I'll show the await keyword in a moment. So I'm saying public async void fetch Bing pics. I'm passing it the keyword, in this case Seattle, and I'm passing it an object. The reason why I say an object here instead of like a list view or a grid view or something like this is that I just want to write one function to do the binding to the control, whatever the control is, be it a list view or a grid view or something like that. So standard object-oriented practice, I can pass it the superclass and then subclass it later on. So then I create an HTTP client. You may be familiar with web client if you're a C# developer. And VB, it's pretty much the same thing. All of this will work in VB. I just happen to have built it in C#. So I create a new HTTP client, and I call my URL to get my Bing data. My Bing data is going to look like this. So this is an example of me calling it. So the Bing data, it's XML over HTTP. As I've been saying all along, it's my personal favorite way of doing this thing because it keeps it very, very simple. In my Bing data, I'm just going to be retrieving a number of images, and these images are within these, the results of the image search are within these image result nodes. So I have a number of these image result nodes, and things like the title, the URL, the display URL, and the thumbnail are all stored within there. So I'm just going to do a call up to Bing. As you can see here, just a straight XML over HTTP call like I would have done in the browser, and get the content and read that content back as a string. Now, nowhere are you seeing dispatcher.begin invoke or any of that kind of stuff here. And as you saw when I demoed it earlier, there was no blocking on the UI thread. Everything just continued as normal. And that's it. It's as simple as that. I attribute my function as an async, and when I call the HTTP stuff and I want it to be asynchronous, I just say await the result. And the processor will basically hand execution back to the UI thread in between here and here. And then once it's done with the call and it gets the stuff back, then it goes right onto here. So if we look at that as the app in action again, so if I execute it and I search, so if I go back to our good friend Scott. Sorry, it's dark here, I can't see my keys. If I go back to my friend Scott and I do a search, now you see it did that call and it did the render of this pretty fast because I'm just rendering the thumbnails. But if I say select this one, you see again it was pretty fast in getting them, and no UI threading was being blocked whatsoever. And I have to be, it does have safe search on, but I just have to be careful that all the images I render are okay. But one of the nice things about Bing, by the way, if you write an application like this, is that you can set it for safe search so that it doesn't do anything offensive if you ever want to demo stuff on stage. So I have this thing that I've done talks all over the world on Silverlight, and I always try to make sure that my demos work. There's nothing worse than a demo failing while you're talking on stage. So I give myself a motivation to say that if my demo fails, I have to do something humiliating. And that's usually, it's like whatever country I'm in, I have to sing a song in the language of that country. So that's why I'm really happy to be speaking in the United States. So if I have to sing a song, it's in English. So, but thankfully my demo's still working. Okay, so let me switch back to the slides. So I've had it actually where I was doing a keynote at a tech ed in Israel, and my demos failed completely, and I had to sing a song in Hebrew. It was not fun. I had mentioned there were three things. So first was acquiring data. Then now that you've got the data, what are you going to do with it? How are you going to shape that data to render it in your UI? And how are you going to actually use that data? So you've downloaded your data asynchronously. You've gotten it. Now what? Link. Who likes Link? Okay. Who has never heard of Link? Oh, wow. Okay, everybody here knows Link. That's good. So one of the things that we really want to do with Windows 8 is to reach new developer audiences. That's why you've seen HTML5 and JavaScript paradigm for building Metro-style applications. But if you're a .NET developer, you've got this huge tool in your toolbox called Link. And for managing data, as I'm sure you're aware, it makes life very, very simple. For folks who are watching the video, if you haven't heard of Link, my elevator pitch for Link is that it's a lot like SQL. It's a language that you can use to select objects that meet certain criteria and just query against the objects that you have in memory, the way SQL queries against a record set in a database. And your familiar skills in Link, for the folks in the room, they still apply. You can still use Link. For those of you who've probably learned Link, you can buy these great big thick books on Link. There's so much to it. And if you've got those skills, you don't want those skills to go to waste. So building Metro-style apps in Windows 8, those Link skills that you've put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into learning, they definitely still apply. So some of the things that we're going to show, using Link then to shape your data and bind it to controls, and how you bind it to a control. Some of the controls like the list box and the grid view that I've used in this application I'll be showing, and show how we did that. And then also I want to point out some of the SDK samples that are out there. If you haven't yet taken a look at the Metro-style apps developer SDK, I strongly recommend you take a look at it. There's some fantastic stuff in there. And when I was building the app that you've just seen, it was invaluable. I just went into the SDK sample apps, borrowed the code, and was able to use that in here. So, and then as I've mentioned before, one of the things that's a slight difference when building for Windows 8 apps is being able to use the grid view control and grouping content into that and using iGroupInfo. Take a look at the SDK samples for that. I'll be showing that a little bit as well. Or there's also Hamid's talk that I mentioned earlier on. He goes into a lot of detail on that. So to take a little bit of a look at these, the collection controls. I will switch over to my laptop. And back to this application, the related image search. And I will go into the XAML. Again, is that readable? Do I need to make it bigger? Can everybody read? OK, I see now. It's great. So defining a user interface in XAML in Windows 8 is pretty much the same as defining a user interface in XAML for Windows Phone 7, for Silverlight, for WPF, anything like that. Since the keynote the other day, just about every conversation I've had with folks, who've used XAML is like, Microsoft first brought out WPF and then brought out Silverlight, and the XAML changed a little bit from WPF to Silverlight. Then Windows Phone came out, and the XAML changed a little bit from that. Now Windows 8 is coming out, and Metro-style apps, and the XAML's changing a little bit from that. And I'm getting a headache trying to keep it all straight. But what I'd say is, and the answer that I generally give is that most of your XAML stays the same. When I look at a typical XAML document, your XAML document's this big. The top 80% of that is probably things like Visual State Manager, styles, templates, all that kind of stuff. That's pretty much staying the same. There's really nothing different there. And then your bottom 20% of your document is like the controls themselves, the controls that you're putting on, where you want to lay them out, what those controls are, and the declarations for those controls. And that's probably one that changes the most, just because the controls are different between the platforms. So for example, Windows 8 has that really nice app bar that you can swipe up from the bottom. That app bar isn't present in WPF or Silverlight, or at least not yet. Those kind of things aren't present, and as a result, that's going to be the difference that you have in XAML. But the important thing is if you know XAML, if you know how to read XAML, if you know how to type XAML and parse XAML, you'll see it's pretty much the same thing. I mean, even look at some of the namespaces at the top. What year is that? It's 2006, and it's like the original XAML, and it's the original XAML namespaces that you've seen all along. So for the application that I've been showing, this related image search application, I just wanted to make the UI pretty simple. And if you remember, I'm sure as XAML developers, you're all familiar with Stack Panel, and I love to use Stack Panel for layout, and Stack Panel is present in every flavor of XAML. And all that I've done here for the application, if you imagine, there's the area across the top, where you had the text field and the text box and the button. And then there's the area at the bottom where you had the list view on one side and you had the grid view on the other. So that's one area of controls on top of another area of controls. And if you're not familiar with the stack panel, that's what the stack panel does. You specify a vertical stack panel, and it will take all its children and stack them vertically. And that's what you can see here. My root stack panel is just a vertical one. And then at the top of the screen, I had the text block, the text box, and the button control. They're all stacked horizontally, and you can see it's a stack panel that's horizontal, containing those three controls. And then underneath that, I have my list box stack panel and my grid view stack panel, and my list box and my grid view, and they're within a stack panel that's horizontal. And that's just how I'm laying out my UI. Very, very straightforward, very, very simple. But when it comes to the data within them and binding the data, if you've ever done data binding, this code will look very familiar to you. So I just when I rendered for example, my list box, you saw it was images with a little text label underneath them. So the image is just bound to something called the thumbnail. I'll show where the thumbnail comes from in a moment. And the text is just bound to the title. And this is all I have to do in XAML to do that actual binding. In my code later on, I'm going to say that source for the data. I'll show you how we got that. The source for the data was the results of the link query. But that's it as far as binding is concerned. And that's all I have to do. And I'm loading that in a data template. And if you're familiar with XAML, it's the same thing as you've used all along. So for my list box, I say, here's how you shape data for the list box. Create a stack panel for each item, put an image in the stack panel, put a text block underneath that image, bind the image to your thumbnail, bind the text block to your title. And it's as simple as that. So that's how the list box control works, and that's how you do it. That's how you use it for binding. Now the grid view is something a little new in Windows 8. So if you've used the Windows 8 devices that you've got, and you've seen the desktop, the way you can swipe it horizontally, to access icons and access applications that are off on the right-hand side of the screen. Or if you use, for example, the Memories app, which was that photo app that's on there, and the same kind of thing, you've got that nice horizontal swipe. A control like the grid view is used to do that. So the grid view control is touch first. You get all the touch goodness in there. But when you're defining data for that control, there's two things you need to do. First is similar to something like the text box, is you define what a data item looks like like a picture control, like a picture with text underneath it. And then secondly, you define how multiple items are laid out. And that's where there's this new thing called a wrap grid in there. So if you remember when I showed the application, if I did a query for Scott Goo's image and I had 100 results back, there were 3 rows of those images, and I would swipe to scroll across them. That's where the wrap grid control would come in, and that's one of the new things that's there in Windows 8. If you're not familiar with it, get familiar with it quick. It's very, very useful. And if I go back and run the app again, we'll see the wrap grid is what gave me these 3 of Scott, and if I was using touch, I'd be able to swipe across with my hand, but I can just use the scroll bar with my mouse. As a developer, I prefer to use keyboard and mouse. As a user, I prefer to use touch. Okay, so that's like a simple look at the XAML for the collection controls. As you can see, there's no real surprises here. It's very, very simple how to build them, and it's very, very simple how to bind them. I'm just binding to like an item in my data collection. So if I go back to my slides for a sec. So what is data binding? Just to do a little bit of a level set, you ask 10 different people what data binding is, you get 10 different answers. But typically data binding, it's the process that establishes a connection between your application UI down here and the business and your data up in the cloud and the business logic up here. There's a number of different steps that you have to get, from your data up in the cloud down to being able to present it to your end user. Now, data binding, it can be declarative or it can be defined in code. Now, declarative data binding is what I showed earlier on, where in my XAML I said, here's my binding, here's, bind to this field, or it can be defined in code. I typically try to do as much of it in code as possible for the express reason that it's a lot easier to debug code than it is to debug markup. So as you saw, like in this example, when I did the markup, the binding for these controls, I just bound to a field, and I'll show how the data got into that field in a moment. Then there's different actions that you can use to customize the binding logic. So you can do a value conversion of data as you take it from up in the cloud and put it down to your UI. So for example, in the SDK, there's one app on data binding, and it's really nice in that they have like a slider that you can slide from 0 to 100. Actually, I'll show it in a moment. And then based on the value that you've slid from 0 to 100, it gives a grade, like a school grade, A if it's 90 or above, B if it's 80 to 90, that type of thing. And that kind of logic can be built into your data binding, which just, it can save you a lot of work rather than pulling your data down, seeing like 1,000 grades, creating a new field for each of those grades, doing that conversion, and then binding to the converted data. You can actually do the binding as part of the actual conversion itself. And then there's binding modes, and I have to be really careful when I say this one because I had a major Freudian slip when I was rehearsing. I won't say what it was, but you can probably guess. So binding modes, when you do binding modes, there's 3 ways you can do it. The most common that you'll probably see is one-way binding. And that's something like what I was showing in the picture app, where the data is coming from the cloud down to your application, but you're not changing anything back on the cloud itself. So like with something like a Bing image search, I'm not changing the images up on Bing. I'm just pulling them down and binding them to my UI. And that's the most common that you'll see. There's two-way binding, which is then where, for an example, for an application, if you are creating something where people like do data entry and they sign into a system and they get their user profile brought down and text boxes are populated with the user profile, and then they change something and submit, and then you rebind. That way you're pushing data back up into the cloud. So that's a two-way data binding. And then there's one-time data binding, where basically the moment your control is initialized, the data is bound, and you're good to go. That's it. Now, a lot of times people ask, well, what's the difference between one way and one time? So for something like the Bing app that I showed here, one time would probably be better than one way, right? The thing is to take a look at using one-time pattern if you only want to bind data once, because it can boost the performance of your application. Because if you think about it, if you've got a control foo that's bound to a collection of data and an item within that collection, every time you're doing something in the UI, or every time like your process is still looking, it's like, has the collection changed? Do I need to rebind? Has the collection changed? Do I need to rebind? Has the collection changed? Do I need to rebind? And that has a cost. Whereas if you do a one-way bind, you bind it, you've done it once, you're done, it can boost your performance. It's something that's well worth looking at. So what I'm going to do is just to put some of that theory into practice, is to take a look at the SDK samples. I'll switch to the laptop in a moment. And in the SDK samples, there's a terrific data binding app. Just give me 1 second. I made the mistake when I was building the reference app, the picture browser that I mentioned, to call it data binding, capital D, capital B with no space in between them. And the data binding app in the SDK has the same name, so it just takes me a moment to switch between them. So if I run this app, and again, I recommend everybody go to the SDK and download these samples. And there's some really nice little code snacks in here that you can use to build your applications around. So when it comes to binding modes that I was just speaking about, one-way, two-way, and one-time binding, if I can get my mouse to behave, you can see it, yeah. So like a one-way data binding is, as I change this slider, you see the text box on the right changes. Let me zoom in so we can see it a little better. So as I change this slider, the text box over on the right changes to match the slider. For two-way binding, if I change the slider, the text box matches. And if I type something into the text box, like 50, and tab out, actually let me do something that's a bit more apparent, 99, and tab out, you'll see that the binding has gone back towards that as well. And then a one-time binding is when the UI was rendered. You know, this was at 100. The text ended up showing 100. And no matter what I do to this, it stays as 100. So how do you do this? I'm going to zoom out. So how are you going to do this? If I take a look at this in Visual Studio, and you'll see that if you download the SDK samples, they're split into scenarios. So like you saw, I had a list box there of the different scenarios. Go into your XAML and take a look at the scenarios, and they're all, excuse me, they're all nicely commented. So that was scenario 1. So if I look at the scenario 1 output, I can see my XAML, and I can see how my binding worked. So if I just give a quick example of the two-way one, can you see that? Let me zoom in. So if I take a look at the two-way, you can see here I have my slider. Oh, that was the one time, sorry. So I have the slider that you saw. That was the data source for the text box. And then on my text box, I'm doing my binding. And you can see the binding is the sliders. The slider is what the text box is being bound to. What on the slider you're binding to is its value. And the mode is set to two-way. And it was as simple as that. I didn't have to write any code. I created the slider. You know, you create the text box. You do the binding on the text box. You say it's two-way. So whenever I change something in the text box, it's going to change the value property of the slider. Whenever I change the value property of the slider, it's going to change the text property of the text box, just by saying mode equals two-way. Very, very useful. And this is just a simple example of binding. And there's some great stuff here in the SDK that you can borrow or steal or use in your own code. Another thing for data binding, if I'm just going to restart the app, I mentioned earlier on was value converters. So here's an example of, you know, if you slide this to an actual percentage, I'll zoom in so you can see it better. You know, if I slide this to a percentage, you can see that 100% is a superstar, you know, 80% an A, and 93% A+, that kind of thing. Now, again, thinking about the scenario, if you have a school with 2,000 kids in it, and you're writing an application, and each of those 2,000 kids has a number of grades, and you typically write an application that would pull that data, and you get that data as a percentage point, instead of you going through each one and having logic to turn that percentage point into a grade, if at the time of the binding you can do one thing, and that's to do a value conversion to actually change grade into a letter, this is one of the things that's available to you. So I'm going to zoom out for a moment. And I'll show just basically how that works. So as you're doing your data binding, you'll see here that my text box here for my binding, for my grade, it's using the slider value converter. The slider value converter is defined earlier on. It's using a grade converter. The grade converter is using code. Where did I leave my code? Which is right here. It's an S2 formatter, and what it's going to do at the time of binding is it looks at the value, gives you a letter in return. So when you do that binding, it just changes the letter there and then, so you don't need an extra column to store the letters for everybody, or the grade letter for everybody. Just at the time you do the binding, you actually get it. Alrighty. So again, like I say, SDK samples are your friend. You know, use them, and you can learn from them. You can learn a lot from them. So that's what I've just shown. Templates, I'm just going to go through quickly because we're running a little short of time, and I showed them earlier on. Again, your templates give you XAML that you can use to define not just what your data looks like when it's presented to the user, but also how that sorry, not just how a single data item looks like when it's presented to the user, but how many data items can be rendered when they're collected together. So there's those two ways of thinking about your data and templating it so that you can present it. So to show an example of that and an example of what I mean, I'm going to go back to my image browser. You can define the templates, as I mentioned, for how they're going to appear. I'll go back to my image browser. Just give me a moment. And I showed them earlier on, but I just want to go back and show it again. If I go in here as an example onto my grid view, I've done two things with my data. I have my data template is showing how I render a single item of data. And I have my panel template in showing how I'm rendering the collection of all my items of data. So these are the two types of template to think about when you're dealing with data. And it's back here. So the demoing templates, as I've just done on the laptop. And so the final thing to show in the application is then I've shown the XAML that says, here's how you draw a particular data item. Here's how you show the collection of all those data items and draw them together. But how do you connect the two? How do you make these two meet? So if we go back to the code and we look at the link in this code, and we'll see how to do that. So if you remember earlier on, we had the HTTP call that gets the content, reads the XML over HTTP. Now we're going into link. First of all, I'm just going to parse that XML. It comes down as a string. I'm going to parse that into something called an X document. Let me zoom in. And then I'm going to use link to create a IEnumerable of Bing images. Now, what's a Bing image? A Bing image is a custom class that's within my app. So if I go over here, it's very, very simple. It's a custom class within the data binding app, and this class just contains a title and a thumbnail. The source of the title and thumbnail comes from the XML that we saw earlier on. I'm going to zoom out for a sec so we can see it. Do I still have my browser open? I do. The source of that, if you remember, we had a title, so I'm just going to bind to the title field within our XML, and we have a thumbnail, and I'm just going to bind to the URL within that thumbnail. So if I pop back to my code for a second, my mouse is misbehaving. Pop back to my code for a sec, and you'll see this. So I've just created this class called a Bing image, just got two strings in it, very simple. So I'm going to create an IEnumerable, and an IEnumerable, you just basically think of it as a bindable collection of some things. And in this case, the something is a Bing image. And how do I create that? Well, my XML document, I'm able to use link against that. Link, a lot like SQL, selecting from all of the image results in the document. If we look at this again, we'll see that my images are a collection of image results. They are prefixed by the namespace MMS, and I'm just using the same namespace in code. Glossed over that for the moment. So selecting everything in the namespace called image results. And because it's very SQL-like, I can have a where clause in there. So just for gratuitous demo purposes, I said where the media URL doesn't contain a BMP. I'm just going to render pings and JPEGs and stuff like that. I'm going to select a new Bing image. Remember, the class Bing image has the attributes title and thumbnail. I'm going to just pull out the title from the XML, put it into the title string for this particular instance of Bing image, ditto for the thumbnail, and end up creating this IEnumerable of those images. And like I said, for data binding purposes, think of an IEnumerable as a collection of stuff that you can bind to. And so when I then go down to my controls, this function can be called and ask you to bind either to the list box that was in the app or the grid view that was in the app. So I just passed the generic object in, as you see here. So then I just bind that back. If it was the list box that was bound in, bind it back to a list box, and then set its item source. So that was the final piece of the puzzle. You remember when we showed the XAML, we said binding, thumbnail or binding text field. That's where we're telling the XAML what to bind to in the collection, but how do we tell the UI what collection to actually bind to? That's what I've done in code here. So I'm just saying, for this control, set its item source to be this IEnumerable of Bing images that we've done. And that's it. So the entire UI, the entire app that you saw there, the related image browser, is basically driven off of this code. It's very, very simple, very, very straightforward. Okay. So interacting with the data was the third part that I mentioned. So you've gotten your data down off the cloud, you've shaped your data, you've bound it, and you've presented it to the user. There's a number of different ways that the end user can interact with it. Sometimes it's changing values in a field to send it back up, or in an app such as this one, which is very simple. It's when I clicked on the list box, I have to know what the user did when they clicked on the list box to get that image, to be able to do a query up to the cloud, to get the data to bind to the grid view, stuff like that one. So there's, basically for collection controls, your interaction is single and multiple selection, a master detail view, which is something like what I've been building here, or shopping carts, those type of applications. How are you going to program them? How are you going to build things for single and multiple selection? Well, I always think the best way to do it is to borrow somebody else's code. So I'm going to show from the SDK, there's a very nice little sample called list view interaction. And just give me one moment, I'll switch to the laptop when I've loaded it. So the list view interaction sample basically does all of this for you. So I'll load that. I will change over to my laptop. I will run it. And you'll see the SDK sample. So here's the list view interaction sample. So to show something like, I have my grid view here with my data in it, and I can do a multiple selection of them and get the, the Windows personality in that. Again, if it was a touch screen, I'd be able to touch it and do the selection like that. We'll take a look at the code about how that is done in a moment. Or for a master detail list view, same kind of thing. I can select items in the left, and I can change the content over on the right. Unfortunately, the Latin in the body of the text stays the same, so you only see the title change, but actually everything is changing. Then also I just had to do things like static list views, or how to create picker list views like this. So if I'm, an ice cream place and I want to do banana yogurt with these three things on top of it, this is the sample that does it. So if I go over to my code, and remember the way to navigate through the SDK samples is always look for the scenario X output tag. So like if we're going to look at scenario 1 and 2 that we showed at a moment, if I go through to my XAML and I say that's scenario 2 output. So scenario 1 output was when I had that grid that I could multiple select from. Here I have my grid view. It's bound to the data source which had all the ice cream flavors in it. And here the selection mode is just set to multiple. I declare it in code. The selection mode was set to multiple, and then it allowed the user to do multiple selections. And if I do a search in my code, then for the item grid view itself, actually I won't do it now, I'd be able to, you could then iterate through the selected items array to see which items were selected if you wanted to do something with them. And ditto for the other one where I had the list view. This one's pretty clever, actually, where I did the master detail list. That master detail list was achieved without writing any code. It was just entirely done with data binding. So instead of handling a list selected event and then using that to change the detail view, it just used data binding to do that. So I had my master list view here. It's called item list view. And then I am binding, when my mouse behaves, then it's doing the binding here to the selected item on the item list view. So if you imagine the item list view has n items on it, when I select an item on that one, the selected item property is a value 0 through n, or 0 through n minus 1. And then if I bind to that item, then I know what that value is, and I can then use that value to drive my details view. So this would be how you do it declaratively in XAML. For the sake of the image browser application, I did it in code, where code I think is a little bit easier to understand. So let me come back in here, and you can see my code. So I just have the both of these, they give a selection changed event that fires when the user changes the selection. So within your code, you can say something like the pick list selection change plus equals new selection changed event handler. Let me zoom in so it's a little easier to see. And so very familiar, if you're a C# or a VB developer, it's the same thing. You capture the selection changed event on either of these, and then on the selection changed event, all I'm doing is on I'll say the list first. If the item selected is null, I put this in because I was having a little bug in the app where sometimes you would touch it and it was giving a null back. So I'm just saying if it's not null, then, if it did a null back and I called Bing and sent null, I got a crash. So, I'm just going to say here, pull the selected item from the pick list, cast that to a Bing image, which I can do, You know, that's one of the really nice things about how the casting works in .NET. If you remember, when I built the data template for both the list and the grid, I put those two fields in. There was the title field and there was the thumbnail field. Well, both of those fields exist on a Bing image, so I can actually just take the selected item and cast it to be a Bing image. I don't have to say Bing image x equals new Bing image, x.title equals selected item.title, x.thumbnail equals selected item.thumbnail. I can just cast it off to a Bing image, pull the string out of that, and then call my fetch Bing pics from that. And I do exactly the same on the selection changed for the grid, and that's how I was able to write the same piece of code that would call the Bing service and get the images down from both of them. Alrighty. So we got 5 minutes left. So talking about selection and multiple selection that we did. So to do a quick recap, you know, this was a tour of what's new, what's different with data apps in Windows 8. As you can see, there's not a whole lot different. If you're using the grid view and you want to do the grouping, there's some massaging of your data that you need to do. But one of the great new things is the asynchronous connection, the await keyword, and all that stuff. Thinking in terms of cloud data is very important. But the number one takeaway that I hope you get out of this is that if you know XAML already, and particularly if you know .NET coding, like Link already, those skills still apply. You know, you're golden. You're able to, you know, build your Windows 8 apps right out of the box. If you aren't deep into something like Link, I recommend get deep in it. It's very, very useful. And you know, using Link and understanding how Link does collections and observable collections is very, very important. And you know, it gives you great power in your toolbox to build apps. XAML, you know, particularly templating in XAML, I like to do as much as possible in code, but the templating in XAML, if you want to set up your binding, is very, very powerful and very, very useful. And some of the other things within data binding, like the different modes of data binding, the one-way, the two-way, the once-only way of doing it, and using value converters and data binding will help you make your apps much more efficient. And then we took a little bit of a look at using the new collection controls, and like there really wasn't that much different in using them. And you know, to build an app like the one that I was showing here was like, you know, it's about an hour's work to actually do it. And again, if you want to build that app, if you want to get into the guts of it and see how it's done, use the hands-on lab. I can't remember the number, but it's like 703 or something like that. If you look at the 700s, you'll see it. The XAML apps are in there, and I strongly recommend going into that and getting familiar with it. But most of you, if you're a XAML developer already, there's probably nothing that much new here, and you'll be able to just go ahead and build something like that yourself. Some of the related sessions, just to recap, the Metro-style apps in XAML, as I mentioned earlier, are done by Joe, which is this great overview of everything about building XAML-based Metro-style apps. Touch apps by Alner, he's done a great job in just talking about, you know, we've built this app here, but how do you optimize it for touch? Strongly recommend taking a look at that one. And then Hamid's very, very complimentary talk to this one, where he's then going into detail on the controls themselves. Where I spoke about the data, getting the data, binding it, and all the things about that, he's talking about the new controls and about how you can really, you know, build polished apps using those new controls. Further reading and documentation. I'm a big fan of the Windows 8 SDK. If you haven't downloaded it already, go and get it. There's so many code snippets that you can take advantage of. All of the scenarios I spoke about. I've shown 2 of the apps for XAML. I can't remember how many there are. There's like 20 or 30 different XAML apps in there that you can tear apart, each with multiple scenarios, and learn how to do this stuff, as well as the build hands-on labs. So just want to say thank you very much for coming. I know it's Thursday. It's coming to the end of the conference. And I appreciate you all coming here, appreciate you all coming to build and being Windows developers. Any feedback and questions, we have forums. If you have any questions for me, we've only got 2 minutes left, so come see me afterwards, or I'm going to be over in the Expo Center at the hands-on labs area later today and tomorrow. Any questions around that, please just ask me. And please don't forget to put in your session feedback, particularly if it's good, and at the URL that you can see here. So I just want to say thank you very much, everybody, and have fun building Windows 8 apps.